What happens when policies limit what can be taught? In this session, Ashley Wu of RAND Corporation shares findings from a study examining how state policies restrict instruction on race, gender, and sexual orientation. Wu explains the study's two implications. First, many teachers don't regularly address social and political topics at all in their instruction, but when they do, their instruction broadly aligns with the preferences of U.S. adults. Second, she recommends that schools and districts should address these topics in a factual, evidence-based perspective, in communication with parents, and in a manner that allows for viewpoint diversity and fosters students' ability to engage in civil discourse.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley, and I'm a policy researcher at RAND, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. And one of our areas of research is trying to understand what's going on in classrooms from teachers' own perspectives and how policies of all different kinds influence teaching and learning. Over the last couple of years, we've been fielding surveys to teachers through our large, nationally representative educator panels to better understand how teachers are responding to recent state policies that restrict instruction about topics relating to race, gender, and sexual orientation. And from this work, we've learned that these state policies are having an influence on some teachers' instruction and are having an influence not only about topics covered under state restrictions, but also other topics too, like social emotional learning or climate change. But there was still a lot that we felt like we didn't know. Like, how often do teachers teach about these different topics? And how does this vary by teachers' context? So we asked teachers about whether and how often they addressed a set of 10 social and political topics in their classrooms during the 2023-2024 school year. And of these 10 topics, some were explicitly covered by state restrictions, like those relating to race, gender, and sexual orientation, and others weren't. Among the 10 topics that we asked about, teachers were most likely to say that they address SEL, followed by stories and histories about people of color, racial inequality, and climate change. And meanwhile, fewer than half of teachers address all of the other topics that we asked about. In addition to asking teachers whether they address these topics at all, we also asked teachers how frequently they address these topics. And as you can see here, with the exception of SEL and to a slightly lesser extent, stories or histories about people of color, when teachers did address these topics in the classroom, they usually did so infrequently, most often just once or a few times per year. But it's also important to understand teachers' responses within the context of their classroom. We know from other research that U.S. adults are generally more supportive about teaching about these topics in older grades. And in our prior work, we found that teachers' biggest concerns about addressing these topics most often centered around making sure that kids were exposed to age-appropriate content. And as you can see, this is generally reflected in our most recent data too. For most of the topics that we asked about, with the notable exceptions of SEL and stories and histories about people of color, secondary teachers and especially high school teachers were far more likely than their elementary counterparts to address them. And we also see a similar pattern when we looked at teachers' reported instruction by their subject. That is, we see instruction about these topics popping up in the subjects where you'd probably most expect them, like social studies, where teachers might be discussing current or historical events, and ELA, where these topics might arise in the text that students read. And finally, when we looked at teachers' responses by their state policy context, that is, whether or not they were in a state with or without a restriction, we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that teachers in states with restrictions were less likely to say that they address many of the topics that were explicitly covered by restrictions, like racial inequality, and also a few other topics that weren't covered by state restrictions, like SEL or climate change. And although our results aren't causal, we also found that state policies may be having a particularly strong influence on whether teachers decide to address gender and sexual orientation related topics and SEL. And so with that, I'll close with two implications. First, many teachers don't regularly address social and political topics at all in their instruction, but when they do, their reports of their instruction about these topics broadly aligns with the preferences of U.S. adults. That is, they're more likely to teach about these topics in older grades and also in the subjects where they're more likely to naturally arise as part of the curriculum. And second, to the extent that teachers do address these topics in class, we think it's important that they get guidance to do so in a way that's factual and in alignment with best practices. And so this means having teachers communicate proactively with families, allow for viewpoint diversity, and foster students' ability to engage in civil discourse. And so that way, when these topics do arise in the classroom, teachers can teach about them in a way that best supports student learning. Thank you.